Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the longevity of artists, and I really love this subject because art has always been my primary interest, even though my primary position in life is in health and alternative health and nutrition. So I think we're going to have a lot of fun today looking into the health and longevity and habits of famous artists. Now we're going to start out here with Andy Warhol. He died in 1987 at 58 years of old, right after a gallbladder surgery, which itself is a nutrient deficiency. It's a calcium deficiency causing the stones in the gallbladder. The operation itself, botched, is what killed him. And we know he had other problems in life. He had a nervous system problem. He had a skin problem, obviously. And so these are all nutrient deficiencies as well. Likely had digestive problems as well in there. Another unfortunate case in recent times, the same time frame, in 1988, Basquiat died at age 27 of a heroin overdose, and it was said that he was prone to emotional instability and anxiety throughout his life. Another major figure in modern art, Jackson Pollock, died at 44 years of age. He died in a car accident while he was drinking, single car accident. And not all successful modern artists die young. Robert Rauschenberg died at 82 of heart failure, which is pretty good all things considered, although it still is a nutrient problem, nutrient deficiency. Roy Lichtenstein, I think, still had some productive years in him. He died at 73 of pneumonia. Pablo Picasso, arguably, possibly a contender for the greatest artist of all time. Certainly one of the most prolific and definitely one of my favorite artists. He made it to 91, which is pretty good. He died of heart failure, although his health was failing him for quite a while before he did die. He had some trouble with doctors and such. They weren't able to help him, and I think he still could have squeezed out a few more productive years. He definitely lost a bit of time in some of his health challenges, and he was not able to be productive for months or even years at a time, I do believe, because of his health problems. But he was definitely not known for his health. He was definitely not known as a healthy person. He was known to enjoy smoking and drinking and women and obviously painting. And paint itself, by the way, can be extremely toxic. It depends on where it's from and stuff, but as we go back further in time, you can assume that a lot of the materials are going to become more and more toxic, and we're going to have less overall awareness, so artists themselves are using highly toxic things, often without even knowing it. Georges Braque, partner in crime with Picasso for a long time, he made it to 81. He died officially of a blood clot problem. Could potentially have been exacerbated by injuries sustained in World War I. Either way, I do definitely think he died prematurely. And the blood clot problem anywhere in the body, in this case it was in the brain, but it would usually be labeled a thrombosis, which itself is a nutrient deficiency. Matisse made it to 84. Now, that sounds okay, but he was in quite a lot of pain, it seems, in his last years. He had some surgeries that really didn't go too well. He was quite debilitated in his end years, being left with these major paintings and cutouts as his primary source of expression because he couldn't really do the involved physical type of painting that he used to do. One of Matisse's most famous paintings in English is called The Joy of Life, and I do think that him and many other artists were really on the search for the good life, and they believed that their art and expression was part of it, but overall it is safe to say that quite a lot of them, were not overtly self-destructive, at least not for the majority of their life. Juan Gris, part of the Cubist movement with Picasso and Braque, died pretty tragically at 40 years old in 1927 of kidney failure, nutrient problem. He had other problems as well, especially cardio problems, which are also nutrient deficiencies. Modigliani, one of my favorite artists for sure, died tragically young, 35 years old, from tubercular meningitis, definitely preventable 100% with nutritional strategies. Vincent Van Gogh was a very troubled man throughout his life. He had many anxieties and paranoias and disturbed thoughts, and he was very difficult to get along with by all accounts, and he died of a strange suicide, ruled ultimately to be suicide, possibly some conspiracy of a murder, but it's very likely that it was suicide. Vincent really was a disturbed man, and I don't think the absinthe and the malnourishment, from my judgment of his biographies, helped him. Salvador Dali, one of the most recognizable artists of the 20th century, died at 84 of heart failure. That was pretty good. The same general story, though, of declining health later in life, although Salvador Dali didn't really lead the type of irresponsible life, some other artists did with drug use and alcohol abuse and stuff like that. Paul Gauguin, most famously known in association with the famous ear removal incident with Vincent Van Gogh. Paul Gauguin was staying with him at the time, and he died at 54 years old. It says of heart failure, but it was complications of syphilis and overall poor health in his pretty malnourished and irresponsible lifestyle. This painting by Claude Monet was called, in English, Impression Sunrise, and it gave rise to the name Impressionist that was used as a slander at first. He lived to 86. He died officially of lung cancer, and of course the standard decline, although he did live a pretty full life. He lived long enough to paint water lilies for 30 years, and he did die in comfort. Renoir was another one of the main Impressionists. He made it to 78, but he died of pneumonia, and he did have really poor health towards the end. He was in quite a lot of pain with arthritis, and it was said that they had to strap basically the paintbrush to his hands, and of course he's here in a wheelchair. So his decline was a bit more drawn out than some of the other artists, and he, I think, could have gone on quite a long time. He was a prolific painter, and he wouldn't have stopped if it weren't for the pain and death. Paul Cezanne might really be the godfather of modern art. He died at 67 from pneumonia, and actually he was a bit of an oddball because he was wealthy, independently wealthy. His family, would have supported him no matter what. He was known as a neurotic, obsessive, and he wasn't known for the greatest of health, but he wasn't also as habitually self-destructive as other people. Degas, also known in association with the Impressionists, though not really being an Impressionist himself like Cezanne. He made it to 83, died of a brain aneurysm, which is a copper deficiency, and he was famous for his sort of being a hypochondriac, and his sight failed him later on in life, and so he spent a lot of the last part of his life worrying about his sight and his overall health, and going out to the country for healing expeditions and such. Lautrec, possibly one of the greatest illustrators of all time, was born abnormal, was born with nutrient deficiencies. He was born short and with a brittle bone disease, and he was what they would call deformed, and he died at 36 of syphilis officially, but also alcoholism and just general poor health and a very poor lifestyle, but unhealthy lifestyle. Remember, of course, that syphilis is completely treatable with penicillin. I'm a little bit wary about looking too far back in history for many reasons, but they say that Michelangelo lived to 88, and that's pretty good, and he seemed to have died pretty peacefully at home after a roughly described illness, so just generalized poor health. I guess 88 is fair enough to say, and he seemed to live a pretty reserved life. He wasn't a party animal like some of the other artists, and probably some wine and such like that, but he was a very dedicated worker, and that seems to be his primary ethos. Raphael, one of the great Renaissance painters and one of the great draftsmen of all time, died at 37. So they say of fever, but it was really of syphilis, which is of course preventable with penicillin, and he definitely could have gone on many more years and painted many more great works, although it was really impressive that he was able to get so much done in his short lifetime. Da Vinci, even though he looks a lot older in a lot of the depictions of his older age, he died at 67 of a stroke, supposedly. Of course, we don't really have medical records from that time. This is the 16th century. He was living at the same time as Michelangelo, and interesting that he may have lived not as long as Michelangelo because he was primarily a painter, whereas Michelangelo was primarily a sculptor. I do theorize that painters historically have been exposed to quite a lot of chemicals, not just in the paints themselves, but things used to thin the paint, and like turpentine and stuff like that. And of course, stroke officially falls into the omega-3 deficiency category. The FDA has been forced to release the qualified health claim that supplementing with omega-3 essential fatty acid can help prevent heart attack and stroke. Now, women are pretty underrepresented in art history, but some of the famous ones we can talk about. Frida Kahlo was 47 years old when she died of pulmonary embolism, which is multiple nutrient deficiencies and probably diet-related as well. Mary Cassatt was known with the French Impressionists, even though she was American. She lived quite a long time, to 82 years old. The natural causes was what it was called. There was no exact cause identified, and she was wealthy, and she seemed to live a rather comfortable life, and again, not an irresponsible character. Georgia O'Keeffe made it to 98 years old, despite being nearly completely blind in the end years. She seemed to get on remarkably well until the later part of her life. Again, seemed to be quite a responsible human being from my synopsis of her biographies. Switch it up to the beloved Bob Ross, who died at 52 years old of lymphoma, cancer, and of course his iconic hair was a wig in the later years, and this is very unfortunate, and I do believe that this is actually because of fried food and his stir-fried habits, deep-fried habits, and of course taking cancer drugs. Chemotherapy is very likely to kill you. Taryn, another major figure in modern art and street art, he died at 31 years of age. They said from AIDS, which to me means he died of AIDS drugs or AIDS treatment, and very likely just died of pneumonia in a weakened immune state from the drugs, not necessarily from the presence of the antibodies themselves. John Singer Sargent wouldn't really be well known in the public, but he is one of the greatest painters of all time, one of the greatest realist painters, one of the greatest portraitists, and arguably the one to apply technical skill to impressionism better than anybody else ever lived. And he died at 69 years old of cardiovascular disease, which to me is a shame. I love his work, and I do reckon he could have got at least a couple of other decades, and if it weren't for these simple nutritional problems, completely preventable. Tom French also isn't very well known, but he was one of my favorite painters in the living time. He just died at the end of 2019, age 37, of cancer. Again, just another very spectacular shame to me. We've got a lot of very talented artists dying too young. One of my favorite artists of all time is known as Dare, Siggy von Coding. He died in 2010 of brain cancer, and I do have to say that spray paint and aerosol in general would be extremely toxic, not just because of the chemicals themselves, but also because of the particulate matter, which can get into lungs. A lot of graffiti artists die of lung cancer, and actually I think graffiti art in general is probably the least safe art activity that you can do, and definitely they must have one of the shortest lifespans possible across the arts. Don D. White's a legend in the early days of graffiti in New York in the subway, and this is kind of what started the whole thing. He died at 37 years old in 1998 of the consequences of AIDS, or the AIDS drugs. Sace, or Dash Snow, died at 27 of a multiple substance overdose and abuse, I'm sure. Just generalized poor health, I'm sure. Didn't know him, and a lot of the graffiti artists, their biography is not going to be published, but very generally it's a pretty destructive lifestyle overall. There are some clean living graffiti artists and muralists, but the ones that are really out there, hitting the streets and the trains, there's a lot of danger involved. There's a lot of accidents. People could fall off roofs and such, but mostly it is drug problems, drug overdoses, drinking. Suicide is very prevalent as well. Before I get to some conclusions, I want to look at some of the most successful artists today. Damien Hirst is 53 and he's worth $300 million. I'm interested to see how long he lives, and some of these living artists, I'm interested to see if they use their money on longevity strategies, if they learn anything from some of the information that's out there, or if the money doesn't help them and they get the best medical treatment that they can and the medical treatment ends up killing them. You notice a lot of the artists died from AIDS treatment, or cancer treatment, and a lot of them just degenerated, without their doctors of the day or of modern day being able to help them. Jasper Johns is 88 years old, and it's good to note that a lot of artists really don't reach success until after this mark, where a lot of the artists died younger, right? Before their 40s, a lot of them don't really make it with success, and it does seem that some of them that made it a lot longer, like Picasso or Monet, they did have career success. They did have the comforts that come along with it. They didn't need to really stress out that much about their physical aspects of living. Picasso didn't like to leave the house very much, for instance, right? Michelangelo is another example, just another worker. One of the conclusions here, I guess, of the people that show up on the later end of it, they lived to 80, 90, they seem to have worked the whole way through. Their work ethic was stronger than their party ethic, was stronger than their drug or alcohol abuse ethic, right? They were more into work than they were about the things that got a lot of the artists into trouble. I'm not going to go through the rest of the list of the successful living artists. It's just to kind of illustrate that the success of an artist really is going to be determined mostly later in their career. A lot of the artists who died young who are on this list, we only really know them because they happen to be associated with art history itself, right? Vincent Van Gogh, there's a chance that we might never have heard of him if he wasn't associated with the history of Gauguin and the other Impressionists, and the meetings that he happened to have with other influential people at the time, perhaps because he had an interesting biography as well. But definitely on his own power, he was not going to be known as an artist, especially since he was such a repellent person, just for one example. So the artist needs to spend some time in their craft. They need to spend some decades in their craft, and they also need to spend decades in the political, human, social environment that is the art world of their time, and climb the ladder, so to speak, before they really do gain the monetary success. There's some examples in this list who had money besides art, right? Cezanne was supported by his family. Mary Cassatt, same thing. Degas, very wealthy, right? So this does seem to be necessary, not necessarily in the treatment that they're able to afford, but in the lifestyle that they're able to afford and the stress taken off of them. Having said that, some of the ones that lived a long time, like Picasso, Monet, for example, Renoir, very humble beginnings, very hungry years, I'm sure, in the early years, especially when they broke off on their own. There's lots of stories of these guys not being able to pay their rent and such, right? Monet trying to pay his rent with paintings, Vincent Van Gogh trying to pay his bar tabs with paintings, right? So having hungry years in the beginning isn't necessarily a bad thing. They're not really able to overindulge as much as some of the more spoiled people or artists out there, right? They are able to, out of necessity, put more effort into their art, both for their career's sake, but also because you frankly don't have that much else to do if you are a poor person. So having a poor period at the beginning doesn't seem to hurt their longevity. It seems to help their longevity, but definitely gaining success later in life does seem to be key. There is not very many examples of artists who stayed poor for long periods of time and died at a respectable age. So we haven't really compared to the general population at all, and that really wasn't the point of this video. It's sort of just exploring the things that are going to be key to an artist making it long term, which I do think is one of the goals of an artist. They are aiming to make art to outlast them, but I doubt very many of them are keen on exiting too early. Certainly many of them would rather have put in more work, and a lot of them, as we see, the ones that made it to the old age, they got past the challenges of the artist lifestyle for many decades. They made it through that, and then they suffered with degenerative diseases, and now we know how to deal with that nutritionally, so that a lot of that can be avoided, a lot of that pain can be avoided. A lot of the people out there in the wild environments, the blue zones, who live a long time, they don't tend to die of degenerative diseases. They tend to die on a cold night, something like that, more or less peaceful, more or less uneventful, and they don't have the arthritis or the cancer or the diabetes or the complications of degenerative disease that we've seen quite a lot of here. So one major thing to avoid seems common, sense. Avoid drugs and alcohol abuse. A lot of the artists that made it to a long time, they did experiment with drugs and alcohol, and Picasso and such smoked prolifically for many years until their old age and that kind of thing, but they really didn't hit the gutters hard, in the abuse of alcohol and street drugs and stuff like that, which really can shorten your lifespan significantly. You notice the heroin overdoses and such. Another key thing here is going to be to avoid the AIDS drugs, right? This seems to be the only thing that can take you out in accordance with AIDS. You notice nobody else is called an AIDS death until they basically discovered AIDS, which is a kind of a weird thing. And then, of course, these people are dying once they're in treatment, and their health fails rapidly once they're in treatment. So one major thing to avoid if you want to have longevity as an artist or as a human being would be to avoid AIDS drugs, avoid abuse of alcohol and drugs. Work hard. It seems to be a good thing in these artist lifestyles, and the ones that made it the longest, they work the hardest to tend to, and they kept working until the end. Seems to be an important point. They didn't retire at age 65 and just sit around. They kept working as long as they were physically able. And again, a lot of those final years and a lot of these old artists could have been extended significantly just with basic nutritional protocols to prevent the degeneration. Another big one here is syphilis, right? Tragic that so many amazing artists have been lost to syphilis, and of course that's completely treatable in modern times with penicillin, and so we never have to lose another artist from syphilis. And of course we don't really know the full impact of the chemicals and paints and turpentines and such like that, but in modern times we have really caught up with this. There's even spray paints that have been developed that have a lot less of the carcinogens and a lot less of the problems, and of course you can wear a modern respirator, which works quite well. Again, we don't really have stats because this is all so new. I still do think it's going to be impactful on the health overall, if you are breathing in fumes, but we can also hack the nutrition, right? We can give the body nutrition that we would get in the more now wild environment that these guys wouldn't be getting in Paris or New York or wherever they were in the food supply. They have the same nutrient access that we do. But an artist now really doesn't have to use anything toxic, so that's quite good, and I think they can avoid a lot of the problems that we have seen here and maybe utilize some of the strategies and some of the successful artists and live a long, healthy, successful life. That's it for now, guys. I appreciate all you joining me. Let me know in the comments, let me know in private message, anything else you want to see covered.